And welcome to the Red Pill Sports and Entertainment Show, as usual, brought to you by Open Source Self-Defense and Fitness. So, today's show, guys, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Gracie self-defense curriculums. In particular, it's made up of 3 parts: the Women Empowered system, the Gracie Bullyproof system, and what I would consider to be the flagship program, Gracie Combatives. Now, eventually, I really wanted to do a review of each individual program, starting with the Women Empowered and then moving on to Gracie Bullyproof. However, I really feel like because there is so much to discuss, before giving a full review of the entire package, I think the best approach is to do a review of each program individually. So since it's kind of the flagship program, we're going to start with the Gracie Combatives program. Now, before I begin, let me say that for an at-home program, something that you can order and get, DVDs, something that you can buy online and follow the program online, I feel like it is a 5-star out of 5-star program. Okay, I think this is the flagship. It is the standard for what can be done with an at-home self-defense program. Now, the problems is that just because it is a flagship program, just because it's a very good program, because I believe it's the standard, does not mean that there aren't both pros and cons to the program. So let's get into some of the pros first of the Combatives program. Well, the very first pro of the Combatives program is that it is a self-defense based program. The second pro is that it does use no-gi techniques. In other words, all of the techniques, there's nobody in the videos is wearing a jiu-jitsu outfit, jiu-jitsu uniform, a kimono, a gi, whatever you want to call it. They're basically in t-shirts and gi pants, which could be blue jeans or they could be sweatpants or even shorts, right? Nextly is that it has a linear and sequential model for teaching the system. And then the fourth pro is that it introduces the concept of building kinetic body movement chains. We're going to talk about all of these things a little bit more if you don't quite follow. And then number 5 is that it offers the option of a quality evaluation. So let's look at each one of these individually on their own. So first, let's look at the self-defense based. What do I mean by this? Well, first of all, it's geared toward beginners that have no martial arts experience. So even if you've never taken a karate class, a wrestling class, a jiu-jitsu class, a kempo class, kung fu, krav maga, whatever, you name it, you will be able to follow the way that this particular system is set up. Next, all of the movements are fundamental and foundational grappling techniques as they apply to self-defense. Okay? And next, the focus is pretty much placed mostly on the quote worst case scenarios, namely being on the bottom of the fight. And there's a really good focus on the details. So a lot of these techniques, like most things, you can go out and you can find all of these little how would you say, techniques individually, right? You could find them on YouTube or whatnot. That being said, those videos do not call in and focus on small details such as hand placement, such as foot placement, the shifting of the hips, why this hip is down and why this hip is up. Okay, explaining why you're making the grips on the person that you're making. Okay, those details are generally not addressed in a YouTube environment. So that's why this particular system is really what I would consider the flagship or the standard of what can be done with an at-home system. Next, the idea that they're teaching all of these techniques without the gi. Okay, so first of all, that adds an element of realness. You know, most bad guys that you're going to come in contact with that are going to, you know, try to fight with you, they're not going to use gi-styled attacks, right? They're not going to try and grab your lapel. They're not going to try and grab your collar and choke you with a collar choke, right? Essentially, most of the time, what they're going to do is attack you, you know, just by either the big sucker punch or the big tackle or the shove, something of that nature. That makes most of the techniques more universally applicable to our self-defense, right? And it also doesn't distract from the focus. You know, the focus being that we're in a self-defense environment, or that's what we're learning. You're not overly concerned with formalities and, ooh, well, he kicked or he punched and the gi snapped, and so I want my punch or kick to have a little snappy sound too, right? So it doesn't distract from the focus of what the curriculum is. Next, the linear sequential model. So the lessons are set up in a sequential order, i.e. they go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it also comes with a schedule of when to go back and repeat each lesson. And the schedule is put together very well in the sense that it reinforces the techniques before you have an opportunity to forget them. So what I mean by this is that, for instance, it might go, okay, practice lessons 1, 2, and 3. Now go all the way back to 1 and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then it might go, okay, go back and do 1, 2, and 3 again, and then 7, 8, 9, or something to that effect. I can't remember what the actual schedule is, but there is a schedule to it. And what it does is it starts to make sure it's reinforcing that you understand those techniques, that you don't have time to forget them, while at the same time integrating and making the connections to other techniques. And while sparring, or, you know, what we call randomized learning, is the best way for long-term retention of skills. So for instance, if you were a soccer player, like, you know, the best way to teach kids how to play soccer is actually to have them play the game, right? And through the play of the game, they will actually learn more skills, more useful skills, than if you had them do drills all day, right? Now the drills, those are what we'd call linear learning, right? What those really are for is to build confidence, right? So even though randomized learning is better for long-term retention, what the linear sequential model is good for is building the confidence of the person who's a beginner, right? And that's really more important in the beginning, is that you build their confidence so that they stick with the training. Next, the training introduces the concept of building kinetic body movements. I kind of touched on this in the last pro. Basically, they call them reflex development or fight simulation drills. And what they do is give a logical and realistic scenario in which you combine two or more of the techniques, right? And they're not always necessarily linearly connected. So it's not necessarily, oh, do lesson 1 technique and then do lesson 2 technique and then do lesson 3 technique. You could go from lesson 1 to jump to a different lesson, and you connected those 2 lessons. So it kind of gives some idea, some randomization to us, in a sense, to the techniques. And so this trains your body how to move. And while it's not completely on the same level as sparring, right, it does add a certain level of resistance, and that really is what helps with the muscle memory of how to move. You could compare this to a boxer doing mitt work with their coach, right? The coach, even though the combinations are kind of predetermined and they have their set of combinations they like to throw, the fighter never really knows for sure which combination is going to be thrown, or whether or not he's going to have to dip or slip or pull, right? He may have to do a number of those variations of things, and they're put together in a more randomized pattern. So even though the punches are sequential and the techniques are sequential in a certain sense, the idea that you're building muscle memory without actually having to spar is what they're looking to do. And then the last pro is the option of a quality evaluation. So at the end of the program, if you would like, you do have the option of being evaluated by an actual person specifically trained to teach and evaluate this program, the Combatives program, the self-defense program, okay? And what they offer is either you can video record yourself and upload it and email that off or whatever, or you can go to the Gracie Academy in Torrance, California, I believe, or you can visit a Gracie CTC. That stands for Certified Training Center. And so when you get there, basically what happens is the coaches will basically watch you train. They will put hands on with you, and then they'll know, okay, you're moving properly or you're not. They'll evaluate you, decide if you actually know these techniques or not. Now, at one time, Gracie University used to offer a official Gracie Blue Belt. Later that changed to a Gracie University Technical Blue Belt. And then with more and more pressure, I think it was mostly pressure from the other jiu-jitsu community, the Gracies finally came up with what they determined to be a Gracie Combatives or self-defense belt. And the self-defense belt is a white belt that has a dark blue stripe down the middle of it. Now, we can debate, and we'll get into it a little bit more about the belt system and the Gracie Combatives belt system, and that can all be debated. But long and short is that the evaluation process can be a pro. So what are the cons of the Gracie Combatives program? Well, number one is you're not taught, or you don't learn directly from an instructor. Number two is there's not enough focus on the standing aspect of a self-defense altercation. Number three is there's not enough emphasis on escaping from the situation, from the altercation. Number four is that useful gi concepts are not covered. Now, red pill moment here, guys. I know it's not common for people to believe this, but just because something I just said a while ago was a strength, which is no gi being used, it's a strength, but it can also be a weakness if you don't understand the limitations of that strength. And so in this sense, there are very useful concepts with a gi that were not covered. Number five, with the advent of MMA or UFC, however you know it, the system is a bit outdated. And then number six is the evaluation and belt accomplishment could give a false sense of security. Again, guys, red pill moment here. I know this is contrarian, outside of the box thinking that, oh my gosh, how can you contradict yourself? But the reality is even though it is a strength, the evaluation that is, it can also be a weakness if you don't understand its limits. And that's what we're going to talk about. So, the first weakness, the whole thing about not learning from a live instructor, this is a universal con for all at-home training methods. I don't care what method you're talking about. I don't care if you're talking about Taibo, or I don't care if you're talking about CrossFit. I don't care if you're talking about kettlebell swinging. I don't care what it is, okay? when you're at home and you do not have a trainer, if you do not have somebody who is taught how to teach, right? Somebody who understands how to teach and give you these skills, okay? It is a drawback. It's a con for an at-home system. That being said, the online Gracie University is a great attempt to mitigate this drawback. They do have coaches which you can, type in a question, and there are coaches specifically that get online and they answer those questions and give you feedback when you have questions about a technique. So while it is a con, I feel like Gracie University did a great job trying to cover that con, right? Trying to take care of that and strengthen that weakness. Next is the lack of focus on the standing aspect of a self-defense scenario. First off, I don't think that the system adequately covers the sucker punch scenario, in which, somebody just walks up and takes a swing. It's not completely out of the blue usually. Generally speaking, you've done something to this person that, they think warrants swinging on you. But I just feel that the sucker punch scenario is not covered enough. Next, well, distance management is mentioned and it is covered. It could have been covered in a bit more depth and a bit more detail. Like, for instance, I would say after the crazy punch, right, the crazy big overhand right, and the tackle, I would say probably the third most common attack would be somebody kicking you with their strong leg, whether it be their right leg or their left leg, depending on which leg is their dominant leg. And that's not ever really covered. And so, and it's not that they have to address every single strike, right? I'm saying the highest percentage, the things that are the most likely to be done. And since that, I understand it ranks very low because, the percentage for the big haymaker punch or the tackle are so high that falls relatively low. It should at least been addressed with the whole, even if you don't have an answer for it, it's okay because this, and this. I really wish they would have at least covered it that way. Next, the other parts of the stand-up that they didn't cover sufficiently in the combatives program is grip breaking of the wrists. When somebody grasps a hold of your wrist or grabs a hold of your hair, etc., right, your clothing, whatever the case may be, it wasn't sufficiently covered in the combatives program. Next is, I felt as though there wasn't enough emphasis on escaping the altercation. After a few lessons, the emphasis subtly changes kind of to a, quote, winning the fight mentality versus survive and escape mentality. And I feel that, because it's open source self-defense's philosophy, of course, I feel like that needs to be emphasized more as a legitimate form of self-defense or self-preservation, right? Because really that's what we're talking about when we talk about self-defense, is really we should call it self-preservation, right? Training, not self-defense training. Because you're not there to try to win a fight. You're trying to not get hurt seriously or killed, right? That's what you're trying to escape from. Next. Now, I know, again, like I said, red pill moment here, guys. Stick with me. There are gi concepts that were not covered that would be very useful in a self-defense situation. Okay. Now, I don't know why they didn't cover them. Okay. It could be because, much like myself, it's where they're from. Maybe the weather doesn't dictate that people generally wear long sleeve clothes or pants, long pants, right? So, like for instance, here in the Mesa Gilbert area, a lot of times people don't wear sleeves. So there's a certain level of, well, what do I need? How does wearing a gi help me, right? To understand those techniques. Well, most other places are not, Southern California or, the Valley of the Sun. So breaking grips on clothing, such as somebody grabbing a hold of your sleeve or your collar or your pants, right? And how to get away from those particular control tactics. Those are super useful in a self-defense scenario. Next, using your grips to stop somebody from trying to take you down, to stop a tackle, to stall out a tackle, or even using them to like control the limbs and keep somebody from punching you, right? Those could have been covered a little bit more, I feel, and they're very, very useful in a self-defense situation. Next, we have the advent of MMA, right? And it makes the system a bit outdated. So unless the system has undergone some really significant updates in the past year, because that was the last time I checked out the program online, a lot of the advice is a bit outdated in the sense that it leans heavily on the concept or the idea that your opponent is not only untrained, but to a certain respect is ignorant to the concepts of jiu-jitsu. And that may not be completely the case. I mean, many times people who might be wanting to look for a fight may in fact be fight fans, right? They may be people who watch the fight, and those guys, they think they've seen oh well, I saw so and so armbar somebody, so I'm an expert at that now, right? Then so they're going to understand the concepts. They're going to I don't even want to say they're going to understand the concept. They're going to be aware of what the guard is. They're going to be aware of what an armbar is. They're going to know, hey, maybe it's not the best idea for me to allow you to hyperextend my arm here, right? They're going to know, hey, they're closing their legs around me. Oh, I need to struggle and do everything I can to get out of here because it's a bad idea for me, okay? So there's certain ideas and advice that kind of is a bit outdated in the Gracie Combatives program, especially given that you're not getting to do live sparring with actual resistance. Again, that feeds into the weakness of you're not with a live training partner or you're not with a live instructor. And then the last weakness or last con is that the evaluation and belt accomplishment can give a false sense of security. I know I just said it was a strength in the last part. I said it was a pro, but it can also be a con, okay? And the reason why it can be a con is that if you're somebody who chases awards or that perfect score, you might think that, oh, because I got an award or because I got this perfect score, I'm, self-defense ready and this and that. And, that might not always be the case. Now, as I mentioned before, and I said we would talk a little bit about it, in the past, the Gracie Academy used to give out official Gracie Academy blue belts. Since that time, they've modified the system. In their first modification, of course, was to go to the technical blue belt. And now they have the Combatives self-defense belt, I think is what they call it. So that pretty much concludes the review of the Gracie Combatives flagship program. If you've had any experience with it, please comment or ask questions if you have questions, or somehow interact with me and let me know what your experience or what your evaluation of the system is. So what I'm going to do is next week, I think I'll do the Gracie Bully Proof program, and then after that, I think the Women Empowered. I think that'll be a better sequential order, simply given the familiarity or the similarity between Combatives and Bully Proof. All right, so that brings us up into discussing a little bit about college football. So it's probably a good time to get into the discussion, because it's getting close to the last, 4 or 5 games of the college football season. And everyone's going to start debating as it gets closer and closer to that time about the one win in undefeated teams and who deserves to be in the college football playoff. Now, let me be on record first of saying that I believe that the college football playoff needs to be expanded to at least 6 teams. I would actually argue for a total of 10 teams. Now, that being said, the reason why I think it needs to be expanded to 6 teams is that really you need to do something where at least one of those slots is guaranteed to not go to a traditional BCS power. It should be going to a dark horse. And let me explain why. Right now in the AP top 25, I'm going to go with that ranking because the coaches poll pretty much mirrors it as far as the top 10 teams in the country. I mean, it gets a little dicey at 10 and 11, but for the most part, it mirrors what the coaches poll says. Alabama right now is ranked the number 1 team in the nation. Okay. I find this extremely interesting given that, pretty much the only 2 teams that have a winning record, which Alabama has beaten, each team is only 1 game above 500, and that's Ole Miss and Texas A&M. And pretty much for the most part, one team after this upcoming weekend will be not this upcoming weekend, but next weekend. One of these teams will be 2 games above 500. The other one will actually pretty much be almost at 500. So I really find it a little interesting that, these teams are not traditional powerhouses as of late. I mean, Ole Miss has not been outstanding over the last few years, but somehow Alabama, is looked at as this great team. Okay. I'm even hearing nonsensical talk in the media that this Alabama team might be the best Alabama team ever. I just find that utterly ridiculous. I mean, if you really look at what Alabama's doing, what's been their ability to do is outscore their opponents. Okay, and what you see when you look at it, and this is the argument you get for Alabama teams all the time, okay, or that you get for SEC teams all the time, is, well, the SEC is so tough. It's so tough. Well, that's not what's being borne out right now in the regular season. That's not what's being borne out. That is not, the case this year. But yet they still get that respect, right? Look at the scores of Alabama. This is the argument now, because you can no longer lean on, the conference itself is just so ridiculously tough. Nobody understands how tough it is to play in the SEC. So now the new narrative is, well, the wins are extremely dominant. Okay, so you have a 51-14 over Louisville, 57-7 over Arkansas State, 62-7 over Ole Miss, 45-23 over Texas A&M. Excuse me, 56-14 over Louisiana, a 65-31 over Arkansas, a 39-10 victory over Mizzou, and a 58-21 victory over Tennessee. Now, as I stated before, Texas A&M, Ole Miss, those are the only 2 teams that actually have an above 500 record at this time. I find that a little bit troubling if I'm an Alabama fan. If I'm being honest, I find that a bit troubling. Because those 2 teams, if you look at the rest of their competition, their games were, I'm not going to say close because they blew out Ole Miss. They beat Texas A&M pretty handily. That being said, okay, with the Texas A&M game, I think that's probably the closest game that they played, 45-23. And most likely what happened is it got out of hand towards the end of the game. Because actually we see that Texas A&M is number 22 in the nation, right? By the AP poll. So what really determines that is depth. But I digress. So the narrative right now is that Alabama is so super dominant in their wins, and this is why they should be the number one. That's why they get so much respect. However, when we go down to look at the number 9 team in the nation, UCF, right? You see a similar pattern. UConn 56-17, South Carolina State 38-0, 56-36, 45-14, 48-20. Finally, one close game when they're away from their home and at somebody else's place. Memphis 31-30, and then a 37-10 victory. But victories that are similarly dominant to what we see out of Alabama. But yet the narrative doesn't carry over, because then the argument is, well, they haven't really played anybody. The strength of schedule is not that great. Well, yeah, that's true, but the same is true for Alabama. Now, let's look at Michigan, okay? A team right now that, if, according to the AP poll and the coaches poll, if the playoff was held today, would not be included in the playoff system, right? And actually, right now, if you look at it again, overabundance, overrating of SEC teams, you have 1, 2, 3 different teams from the SEC in the top 4. But let's look at Michigan. Michigan has played Notre Dame, who has turned out to be an outstanding team. Actually, based on the quality and the depth of their roster, quality of their defense, I think that they could play with and have a chance to beat Alabama or Clemson or LSU. We obviously know that they could beat Michigan because they've done it already. Okay. Let's continue on down. You got the Michigan State. Michigan just beat Michigan State. Guess what? They have a winning record. Okay. They beat Wisconsin. Guess what? Wisconsin has a winning record. They just beat Maryland. Guess what? Maryland has a winning record. Okay? Guess what? They beat Northwestern. Northwestern has a winning record and is leading the Big Ten West. Okay? So it seems a bit disingenuous when, the SEC big sports media guys, they continue to push this narrative. And the reason why the playoff needs to be expanded is because the only way that teams that are outside of what we used to call the BCS schools or the BCS conferences are ever going to get a shot, and really it's not even those that were in those conferences. It's the big schools that have a tradition, right? Even if they're not good every single year. The reason why they're never going to get into the playoff, the reason why they're never going to win a championship is because they're never going to be able to compete at the depth level, right? So say, for instance, a couple of years ago, you had Iowa kept threatening to get into the top 10. But guess what? They never quite got up into that top tier, right? I think they broke the top 10 at one point. They never got into the top 5. And as soon as they lost, it was all the talking heads running around going, see, we told you so, see, we told you so. Well, it's not really an I told you so, okay? Look at Boise State. Boise State was outstandingly good for a long period of time, a sustained period of time, very good, going undefeated, having one-loss records. For, I think it was probably a stretch that was about between 6 to 8 years where they were one-loss or undefeated teams. Okay? Maybe every once in a while a 2-loss would sneak in there. But they never got the recognition. And since they didn't get the recognition, it makes it very, very, very hard to recruit there. You know that if you do not go to a school that is a traditional power, that you are not going to get into the championship game. And even now, as we can see, with 3 different teams, one having a loss, LSU, okay, being put ahead of teams that have no losses, right? And let's just be real here, okay? It wasn't like LSU lost to some amazing team. They lost to Florida, okay? They lost to the Gators. And as I look at it, it's a much more impressive loss that Michigan lost to Notre Dame in a home, or excuse me, it wasn't a home opener, in the opening game on the road to an undefeated team that's now ranked number 3 in the nation, as opposed to LSU, who lost to Florida, who has 2 losses and is ranked number 13. But again, we see the bias for the SEC teams. And so since they're in the SEC, oh, you lost to a better school, even though the rankings don't bear that out. I mean, here's the long and short of it. You're never going to have a perfect system when it comes to college football, okay? I understand that there's always going to be teams that are left out. But it's one thing to leave out the number 7 through 12 team, right? And it's another thing to leave out the number 5 or number 6 team when they actually have better records than the teams above them. At some point in time, conference can't always be the driving factor. At some point in time, actually winning and losing games has to matter. Your resume at some point in time has to matter. Who you beat, the quality of who you beat, how you beat them, all of these things, they all matter. It can't just be when these people deem it so or not. And so that's my big problem. I really feel like the playoff needs to be expanded. And if they're not going to do that, what they need to do is take those traditional quote unquote power conferences, the Big 10, the Big 12, the Pac-10, Pac-12, I guess it is now, the SEC, and ACC. I don't even know why the ACC was included in the BCS teams, but hey, whatever. And those conferences need to be put into their own little set of playing each other, while the rest of the NCAA goes to a true playoff where the conference or division, or however you want to say it, winner moves on into the playoff. Because if you can't even win, right, your own conference, you don't have any business playing for the national championship, right? There's no way the Gators are going to win, okay? There's no way Alabama, Clemson, LSU, and the Gators can all win the SEC. One of them has to win it and the rest have to lose. There's no business of having all 4 of these teams should not be in the hunt for going into the playoff. That's ridiculous. It does a disservice to every other school. It makes for boring games. It makes for a boring championship. I mean, it's just not compelling TV. And, I think that, these other traditional schools, they bring in their own fan base. So you can't tell me it's not about money. You can't tell me Notre Dame isn't bringing a huge fan base with them. You can't tell me Michigan isn't bringing a huge fan base with them. Okay? if a couple other teams were good enough, let's say here on the top 25 AP poll, right? Let's say it was Ohio State or Texas or Penn State, okay? You cannot tell me that those teams, a Syracuse, a Texas A&M, you cannot tell me those teams aren't bringing big enough fan bases that, oh, well, we're excluding them now because it's business. And I'm only addressing this because, I get tired of the sliding scale from the talking heads out there, right? All the people who become college football experts and tell us why we're so wrong for thinking that winning games should matter, right? When it's their argument, it's, well, winning games, that doesn't matter as much as, the toughest conference that you play in. Yeah, but what about when your conference isn't that tough? Oh, well, it's because they're winning by leaps and bounds. Okay, well, this other team won by leaps and bounds. Yeah, but they didn't beat anybody that's good. Well, you haven't really beat anybody that's good, is that good either. Well, our fan base, it's a business, and so they have to think about the revenue. I mean, come on. It's a sliding scale. There's always some kind of argument. And I'm just saying, give the fans what they want. You can't tell me it wouldn't be exciting. And then the last thing that they'll go to, of course, is always the guilt tripping of, these are just college students. We can't have them missing school. Oh, really? Because you pretty much set up spring break and the NCAA basketball tournament completely around these kids missing school. And they miss, if they move on into the Sweet 16 and beyond, they're missing almost a month of school. So don't give me that it's too hard to get done, okay? That, oh, they're going to miss classes. They could all take at least one game off of their schedule and be done with it. Now, again, with the 16 playoff, I think that leaves room to reward the number 1 and number 2 ranked teams in the nation for being a quote-unquote a power conference or whatever you want to call it, okay? While still involving and giving as many teams a chance to win as possible, being able to allow the smaller schools to compete. Because as we know, it's one of those things where I might not be able to win the whole tournament if I'm just an emerging program, but me putting my name up there, just having the shot, that's going to help me recruit. And not recruit my number 1 string, right? Because that's not what really separates the top 10 teams in the nation. It's not their first stringers that really makes them better than the next team. It's their second and third stringers, right? It's the depth. And so just getting my name out there as a small emerging program or a non-traditional power program, just getting my name into that conversation would really benefit me getting my teams up there. And the same with a 10-team playoff. 10-team playoff also still allows for a number 1 and a number 2, to get a bye while having everybody else play. And with 10 teams, I really think you could do some fun stuff with either North versus South or East versus West. I think it could be really fun and be amazing for the college football game. So that's all I got, guys. Some of this will be cleared up pretty well. LSU or Alabama. Well, here's the truth of it. If LSU beats Alabama, Alabama still probably won't fall out of the top 4. Let's just be real about it. Clemson will probably move up, Notre Dame will move up, and Alabama will probably fall to number 4. They'll keep Michigan out of the top 4, and they'll stick LSU at number 3, and that's how it'll go. Because long and short of it is, these guys don't like Harbaugh. That's the real reason why he's not in the top 4, and I think pretty much everybody knows it. So, anyhow, that's what we got for college football. Some really cool, amazing, super fun games coming up. Really like some of the stuff we saw this last weekend. Man, comment, tell me what you guys think about the college football playoff. Tell me if I'm completely off base. Oh, by the way, if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm telling you, look at those defenses. Clemson, Notre Dame, LSU, Michigan, okay? take a look at those defenses and how they play and how deep they are and how quick they are. I don't know if Alabama's going to be able to do what they've been doing to these chump teams. All right, guys. So unfortunately, this has been a lot longer show than what I usually do. There's some things I wanted to get to that I haven't gotten to today, but I think it's going to have to wait. So I think we might do a quick little special before I believe UFC 230 is coming up this weekend, and we'll talk a little bit about that one. We'll talk about basically who I'm picking, why I'm picking them, what I think of the picks. We'll kind of do like a fight breakdown. Might do that on Friday, try to get that out on Friday. And then next week or maybe on Saturday, we'll try and get out even a quick breakdown on what to look for now that we're about halfway through the NFL season. I really think teams need to start considering whether or not they're playing for the draft. And I think there's some real surprises from what we thought we were going to see. I mean, if we look at the bottom of the standings, I mean, bottom is AFC East is Jets, Bills at the bottom. North is Ravens, Browns at the bottom. Jaguars, Colts in the South. Broncos and Raiders in the West. And then over in the NFC, starting in the East, you got the Cowboys and Giants. Then the North, the Packers and Bears. Then in the South, the Falcons and Bucks. And then in the West, the Cardinals and Niners. And it's going to be kind of a weird a draft, I think. A lot of those teams that we mentioned, either we didn't think they were going to be looking for quarterbacks, they're not looking for quarterbacks because they just have an injured quarterback, or they just drafted a young quarterback. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I don't think there's a lot of great quarterbacks coming out in this next draft. I mean, we'll have to wait and see who declares. But right now, teams would have probably really good chance of getting whatever quarterback they wanted if they were in the market for a quarterback. So maybe we'll put something together on Friday, get that out for everybody, and that way it makes it a little bit of fun as we watch the rest of the NFL season to see, hey, who might be playing for that first pick in the draft. Okay, guys, thanks a lot. Remember, as usual, be practical, be purposeful, get fit with a purpose. Thank you so much for spending some time with Red Pill Sports and Entertainment Show.